Welcome to Instrument of Power. Today's critique examines a submitted political news digest covering 10 stories from June 2026, designed to analyze government events through the framework of institutional power.
And the premise is highly ambitious and historically grounded, meaning we can jump straight into the high-level structural feedback.
Exactly. The execution of the individual news summaries does not yet reflect the ambitious analytical framework established in the document's introduction.
Yeah, because the document promises to analyze every story by asking if power is, governed by a system or concentrated in a personality.
Right.
But the actual summaries, like the note about the National Guard deployment in D.C., they just read a standard factual wire copy.
Right. Or Marco Rubio's comments on South African refugees.
Yeah, or even George Santos threatening an NPR reporter over Kelshi bets. There's just no constitutional or institutional framing there at all.
None.
Is there a risk that focusing solely on the basic facts of these events might overlook the specific instrument of power lens the audience is promised?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the suggestion here is to rewrite the individual summaries to explicitly connect the factual events to the core analytical question, right? Like, how is power being exercised or constrained?
Right, so to give a concrete example, instead of simply stating the Save America Act failed despite the former president's prioritization.
Yeah, you could frame it explicitly as a test of personality-driven influence, clashing with the Senate's institutional systems.
Exactly. Or take the violent threat in the Santos story.
Oh, yeah.
Frame that as an attempt by a personality to bypass media accountability systems.
That's a great angle. And obviously, we should remind the listener that these are just a few possible ways to align the text with their stated analytical goals.
For sure. Just examples.
But applying this deep institutional lens naturally requires focused analytical space, which becomes honestly impossible when unrelated facts are crammed together.
Which brings us to the structure. The pairing of disparate news events within single summary blocks dilutes the intended analytical focus of the project.
Yeah, it really does. Coupling the Senate debate on ICE funding directly with the Israel and Lebanon ceasefire agreement in a single paragraph, it forces the reader to rapidly switch contexts.
It creates a super jarring reading experience.
Right? And it makes it nearly impossible to apply a deep institutional power analysis to either event simultaneously.
That's clearly laid out. I wonder, though, if we've considered how combining domestic immigration funding with Middle Eastern diplomacy fundamentally disrupts the analytical flow.
Oh, it totally derails it. The suggestion is to just uncouple unrelated news items to ensure each major story receives the dedicated analytical space required by the channel's historical premise.
So, practically speaking, separate the ICE funding debate into a standalone item focused exclusively on congressional appropriation powers.
Exactly. And then give the Israel and Lebanon ceasefire its own heading, to analyze the diplomatic systems and the broader war in Iran.
Right, emphasizing that these separations offer a much clearer path to executing the intended deep dive analysis.
Yeah, giving them room to breathe. And once unrelated items are uncoupled to give them proper focus, it opens up the opportunity to stitch together the stories that truly do belong together to form a broader narrative.
Which we definitely need here, because several isolated summaries organically point toward a unified narrative of institutional friction, representing a missed opportunity to synthesize the day's news.
Right. Like presenting the Trump administration infrequently backing down, the failure of the Save America Act, and Representative Brian Fitzpatrick crossing the aisle to end the Iran war as completely separate items.
It just fails to highlight the overarching trend, right?
Yeah, the trend of a legislative system pushing back against executive power.
Building on that point, what if we looked at it from the perspective of a broader institutional shift rather than isolated political losses?
I love that. The suggestion here is to weave these related items together to highlight larger structural shifts, grouping them under unified analytical theme.
So, for example, you could combine the isolated notes on the SAVE Act and Applebaum's interview on Democratic backsliding and Representative Fitzpatrick's bipartisan vote into a single, institutional pushback section.
Exactly. And you suggest framing this group section as a case study in how the legislative branch asserts its constitutional boundaries.
Right. And to clarify, that's just one creative way to elevate the material from a list of facts into a really cohesive historical analysis.
Definitely. Well, to quickly wrap things up, Today's critique centers on explicitly applying the institutional power framework to the text, uncoupling unrelated news items to give them space, and weaving isolated but related events into broader structural narratives.
Right. So the actionable suggestions for the listener to implement are adding constitutional context to the Santoth and Rubio summaries.
Splitting the ICE and Lebanon bullet.
Yeah, and grouping the legislative pushback stories.
We invite you to submit your revised work back in for more feedback. Power understood, power governed, power preserved.